Welcome, traveler. Tonight, we explore the world of a young map seller in the heart of 15th century Venice. Now, find that perfect spot where your head can rest easily. Settle into your pillows and allow your shoulders to fall. There is nothing required of you now except to listen as the day fades away. I wonder where you are right now. Is it late evening for you, or is the sun just beginning its climb in your corner of the world? Whatever the hour is on your own beautifully complicated clock, you are most welcome here. If you find a bit of comfort in these journeys, a gentle tap on the follow button ensures we can travel together again. Our journey tonight begins in a small shop where the scent of aged paper and fresh ink hangs in the air. You are Marco Bellini, a young map maker, and the city of Venice hums just outside your door, a constant chorus of footsteps on stone bridges and the calls of boatmen on the water. The burnishing tool felt like an extension of my own hand, its wooden handle worn smooth by my grandfather's grip and now by mine. I ran its polished agate tip across a scrap of vellum, the slick stone creating a perfect, glossy surface ready for ink. Outside my workshop window, the gentle lapping of canal water against the building's stone foundation was a constant, soft rhythm, the heartbeat of my Venice. It was a sound my grandfather had known, a sound that filled the quiet spaces between the scrape of a quill and the rustle of parchment. This workshop was more than a room filled with tools. It was a place of memory, a library of scents, from drying inks and old leather, all of it a testament to a life spent charting the known world. This familiar comfort, however, did little to soothe the knot of ambition and duty that had settled in my chest since his passing. Dominating the great oak table in the center of the room was his final, unfinished work. It was a vast sheet of the finest calfskin vellum, its edges weighted down with lead blocks. On its surface, faint charcoal lines sketched out the coasts of distant lands, places spoken of only in sailors' tales and merchants' whispers. This was not a portolan chart, a practical guide for sailors showing coastlines and harbors. This was something far grander, a map of the imagination, a map of the mythical eastern lands where legend and geography became one. Completing it had become my singular obsession. My grandfather was a master, his name spoken with respect in the scriptoriums and counting houses of our great city. I, on the other hand, was just his apprentice, a young man known only by his family name. To finish this map, to bring his grand vision to life with the skill he had taught me, would be to earn my own place among the cartographers of Venice. It was a way to honor his legacy while securing my own future, a dual purpose that drove me to work long after the last bells had rung across the city, leaving my fingers stained with ink and my eyes tired from the strain of candlelight. Before any real work could begin, I had to take stock of my inheritance of materials, a process that was both a comfort and a source of deep worry. I opened a small wooden chest, releasing the sharp, metallic scent of iron gall ink, the kind we used for permanent lines. I examined the quills, running my thumb along the feathers of goose and swan, feeling for the perfect balance and spring. My grandfather had taught me that a map maker's tools were his voice. A poorly cut quill or a gritty ink could turn a clear coastline into a mumbled, uncertain thing. Everything here was of the highest quality, a testament to his dedication. This made my next realization all the more difficult. From the ink, my attention turned to the surface it would grace. The main map was on a priceless sheet of vellum, but it would need companion charts, smaller details of important regions. The vellum I had in stock was good, but not perfect. True quality vellum, scraped to an almost paper-like thinness with a crescent-shaped knife called a lunellum, felt like cool silk under the fingers and accepted the ink without the slightest bleed. The sheets I possessed were thicker, more suited for ledgers than for a masterpiece. It was a small compromise, but one that already felt like a betrayal of the map's grand ambition. This problem with the vellum, however, was a minor inconvenience compared to the true heart of my difficulty, the one that made my stomach tighten whenever I looked at the vast, empty spaces meant to be oceans. My grandfather had left a note in his journal. The seas must be the color of the sky over the east, a blue deeper than any gemstone. He meant only one thing: ultramarine. To create this pigment, one had to acquire the lapis lazuli stone, a deep blue rock mined in the forbidding mountains of the distant land of Badakhshan. These stones, more valuable than their weight in gold, were then painstakingly ground into a fine powder and purified. The process was long and required a delicate touch. The ground stone had to be mixed into a dough of wax and resin, kneaded repeatedly in a bath of lye, a caustic substance used in soap making, which would slowly draw out the pure blue particles, leaving the gray impurities behind. The result was a blue so brilliant, so luminous, it seemed to vibrate with its own inner light. It was the color of heaven itself, a pigment that could make a map sing. A small pouch of this precious powder could cost a fortune, enough to buy a small boat or fund a merchant's voyage. I needed enough to paint every ocean on the largest map I had ever seen. Artists in our city reserved such a pigment for the most sacred subjects, most often using it for the robes of the Virgin Mary in their magnificent paintings. To use it on a map was seen by some as an act of incredible hubris, a declaration that the work was not merely a tool, but a piece of art equal to the finest altarpiece. This debate was a quiet one among my fellow craftsmen. Were we artisans or were we scientists? Were our creations tools for commerce or objects of beauty that conveyed the power and knowledge of their owners? It was a question many pondered, though few could afford to answer it with a pot of ultramarine. My grandfather, in his quiet way, believed the sea was just as sacred as any subject a painter might choose. He used to say that the ocean was the source of Venice's lifeblood, the great, mysterious engine of our fortune and our fate. To render it in a lesser blue, like the more common and much cheaper azurite, would be an insult to its power. As I stood there, looking at the pale, empty spaces on the vellum, I could almost hear his voice, firm and unwavering. "Do it properly, Marco, or do not do it at all." His words echoed in the silent workshop, a command from beyond the grave. These grand thoughts were brought crashing down to the stone floor by the simple, cold reality of my coin purse. I untied the leather drawstring and emptied its contents onto the workbench. A few silver ducats and a handful of lesser coins rolled out with a disappointing clatter. It was enough to live on for a month, perhaps 2 if I was careful. It was not even close to what I would need to purchase a single small lapis stone, let alone the mountain of them required for this project. The sound of the coins settling seemed to mock the grandeur of my ambitions. A practical part of my mind, the part that knew how to survive in the competitive world of Venetian trade, whispered that I should compromise. I could use azurite, a perfectly respectable blue, and no one but a fellow expert would know the difference. The map would still be magnificent, a testament to my skill. I could finish it, sell it to a wealthy patron, and establish myself. Yet, the moment the thought formed, I felt a deep sense of shame. It would not be my grandfather's map. It would be a pale imitation, a shadow of his vision. My name would be on it, but his soul would be absent. I pushed the coins back into the purse, the metal cool against my skin. No, I would not compromise. This map was more than parchment and ink. It was a promise I had made to him in the final days of his life. He had spent decades gathering the stories, the sketches, the fragments of knowledge required to even begin this work. To fail now, at the very first hurdle, because of a lack of funds, felt like the worst kind of failure. The challenge was not just artistic or technical. It was a test of my resourcefulness, my will. I looked back at the great map, at the faint, skeletal coastlines of unknown lands. The empty oceans seemed to yawn before me, a vast expanse of possibility and of daunting, overwhelming cost. The weight of the task settled on my shoulders, heavier than any atlas in the workshop. My grandfather did not leave me an easy path. He left me a maze, and finding the pigment was only the first turn. The financial reality of my quest had presented a barrier I was only beginning to comprehend. Summary. This part introduced the protagonist, Marco, his late grandfather's workshop in Venice, and his personal and professional quest to complete an ambitious, unfinished map of the mythical East, establishing the primary obstacle, the prohibitive cost of the rare ultramarine pigment required for the seas. End state. Marco has fully assessed his materials, understood the immense financial challenge posed by the need for lapis lazuli, and, despite his lack of funds, has resolved not to compromise on the quality of the map, setting him on a path to find a creative and likely difficult solution. The weight of my ambition felt heavier than the largest atlas in the workshop. My grandfather's map required a sea of blue, a specific, brilliant blue that could only come from the lapis lazuli stone, brought over land and sea from the distant mountains of the east. This pigment, when ground and prepared, was called ultramarine, a name that meant from beyond the sea, and its price was often higher than that of gold. My own coin purse, however, was thin and light. It held enough for bread and oil, perhaps a new quill or two, but not nearly enough to purchase a king's ransom in crushed stone. To compromise with a cheaper blue, like one made from azurite, was unthinkable. It would be an insult to the memory of the man who taught me that a map is not just a drawing, but a promise of truth. Therefore, with no other options presenting themselves in the quiet solitude of my workshop, I knew I had to venture into the beating heart of Venetian commerce. I had to go to the Rialto market. The following morning, I secured the workshop and joined the river of people flowing toward the market. The bridge itself was a noisy, crowded affair, a temporary wooden structure that groaned under the weight of so many merchants, shoppers, and porters. Stepping into the market proper was like diving into a chaotic sea of its own. My ears, accustomed to the gentle lapping of canal water, were assaulted by a harsh mix of sounds. Men shouting in a dozen different languages, the loud clanging of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby lane, and the sharp cries of gulls fighting over a dropped piece of fish. To navigate the space, I had to keep my shoulders tight and my feet sure, dodging loaded carts and children chasing stray dogs. A man roasting chestnuts on a small cart sent a plume of stinging smoke directly into my path, and I turned my head, covering my nose with my sleeve until I could breathe again. The experience was overwhelming, a world away from the focused calm of my workbench. Within this confusing swirl of activity, my purpose kept me grounded. I was not here for silks from Damascus or glassware from Urano. My quarry was far rarer. I scanned the stalls, my eyes searching for the specific type of merchant who dealt in the unusual. My gaze passed over sellers of common spices, fragrant but of no use to me, and vendors of dried fruits whose wares sent a wave of cloying sweetness toward me that I had to step away from. Finally, I spotted him. He was a spice merchant, a man with lean features and watchful eyes, and his stall was set apart from the others. He did not shout to draw customers. Instead, he had small wooden chests laid out on a fine carpet, and I could smell the sharp, earthy scent of turmeric and rare peppers. More importantly, tucked away in a small velvet-lined box were several rough, deep blue stones laced with veins of gold-colored pyrite. It was lapis lazuli. Approaching the stall, I felt my heart begin to beat a little faster. The merchant watched me come, his eyes missing nothing. I gestured toward the velvet box. "A cartographer's interest," I said, my voice steady. He gave a slow, knowing nod and named a price that made the breath catch in my throat. It was even more than I had feared. The sum he asked could have purchased a small boat, let alone a handful of stones. I must have let my disappointment show on my face, because his expression softened slightly, turning from that of a seller to that of a strategist. He looked at my hands, noting the faint ink stains on my fingers that even the harshest soap could not remove. "You are a map maker," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "A man of skill. Perhaps we can come to a different arrangement." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur that was almost lost in the market's noise. "I have a business rival," he began, "a man who brings his ships into the city through less traveled channels. His routes are very profitable. I hear tales, whispers, of how he avoids the customs galleys." He paused, letting the words settle. "A man with your talents could listen to such tales. You could draw what you hear. A small chart, you understand, not an official document, just a sketch of a rumored passage. For such a piece of paper, these stones would be yours." A knot of profound unease tightened in my stomach. What he was asking for was not merely a map. It was a weapon to be used in the silent, undeclared wars of commerce that raged through Venice's canals every day. My grandfather had built his reputation on honesty and precision. His maps were trusted because he never drew a line he could not verify, never marked a harbor he had not studied. To create a map for such a purpose, based on rumor and intended for deceit, felt like a betrayal of everything he had taught me. I pictured his unfinished masterpiece, the vast, empty oceans waiting for their coat of brilliant, truthful blue. Without this pigment, the map would remain a ghost, a silent accusation of my failure. The merchant's offer was a devil's bargain, trading a piece of my integrity for the soul of my life's work. Yet, as I stood there, the scent of his exotic spices mingling with the smell of the nearby canal, I saw that Venice was a city built as much on secrets and shadows as it was on stone and water. I found myself torn between two impossible paths. One was the path of purity, which would leave my grandfather's legacy incomplete forever. The other was a darker road, one that led through the city's murky underbelly, but ended with the brilliant blue pigment in my hands. A new thought began to form, a compromise that settled the storm inside me. I would not refuse the offer, but I would not grant him the true weapon he desired either. "I can draw what the sailors say," I said carefully, "but tales are often flawed. They are whispers on the wind, not truths set in stone. The chart will reflect that uncertainty." He smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. He believed he had won, that he was tricking a simple craftsman. He did not understand that I would fulfill the letter of our deal, but not its spirit. The map I would create for him would be plausible, but incomplete, a collection of rumors that led nowhere definite, protecting my conscience while still securing my prize. With the agreement made, he carefully wrapped the heavy blue stones in a piece of oilcloth and passed them to me. The weight of them in my hand was substantial, a physical anchor for the morally complicated choice I had just made. I promised to deliver his chart within the week, and quickly made my way out of the market, eager to escape its noise and the merchant's penetrating gaze. The stones in my satchel felt both like a triumph and a burden. I had the means to continue my work, to give the oceans on my grandfather's map their proper life and color. But I had also stepped into a world of whispered deals and commercial espionage, a world my grandfather had always warned me against. This was the nature of Venice, I realized. One could not simply be a craftsman. One also had to be a player in its unending game. Back in the quiet of my workshop, I unwrapped the stones and laid them on the heavy oak bench. Under the filtered light from the high window, their deep blue was mesmerizing, like staring into a midnight sky. Grinding them into powder would be a long and dusty process, requiring patience and a steady hand. But as I looked from the raw, unrefined stones to the pale, empty oceans on the vellum, I felt a surge of determination. I had made a difficult choice, one that sat uneasily in my heart, but it was a choice that moved me forward. The path to completing my grandfather's work was proving to be far more treacherous than I had ever imagined, demanding not just skill with a quill, but a willingness to navigate the city's hidden currents. The memory of that bargain at the Rialto lingered long after the market sounds had faded. It was a stark reminder that in Venice, the most valuable goods were often traded not for coin, but for secrets, and that every map, in its own way, charts a course through dangerous waters. Back in the quiet solitude of my workshop, the harsh mix of sounds from the Rialto faded, replaced by the familiar, gentle lapping of canal water against the stone foundation. The heavy pouch of lapis lazuli stones sat on my workbench, a lump of raw potential that felt both a triumph and a compromise. I ran my fingers over the rough canvas sack, the memory of my deal with the spice merchant leaving a complicated feeling in my gut. I had secured the means to continue my grandfather's work, but the path I took felt slick with canal slime, a departure from the honest craft he had taught me. To steady my nerves, I reminded myself that the end goal was what mattered, honoring his legacy, not the murky waters I had to wade through to get there. The first step in this long journey was not with a quill, but with a heavy stone mortar and pestle. The process of creating ultramarine blue, the most prized color in any artist's or mapmaker's chest, was a form of alchemy all its own. I selected the best of the stones, their deep blue surfaces marbled with glittering flecks of pyrite, like tiny stars trapped in a midnight sky. Breaking them down required patience and strength. The initial sharp cracks of the hammer gave way to a rhythmic, grinding crunch as I worked the pestle in circles. A fine, brilliant blue dust began to rise, and I quickly tied a damp cloth over my nose and mouth to keep from breathing in the precious, gritty powder. Each circular motion was a meditation, a physical act that connected me to generations of craftsmen before me who understood that beauty often demanded tedious, back-aching labor. This ground powder, however, was far from ready. This is where true skill separated the master from the apprentice, a secret my grandfather had passed down to me. The process involved creating a special dough, a mix of the lapis dust with melted wax, pine resin, and oil. It was a sticky, messy business, and my hands were soon coated in a warm, fragrant paste. This method, as strange as it sounds, was the key. Scholars in Padua still argue about who first perfected the technique, but every artisan knows it works. The impurities in the stone, like the worthless calcite, cling to the wax, while the pure blue particles, the lazurite, do not. It's a bit of workshop magic, a trick of chemistry that feels almost miraculous every time I do it. After letting the blue-black ball of dough rest, I began the final, most delicate stage. I submerged it in a basin of lye water and gently kneaded it with my fingers. As I worked the lump, a slow, wondrous change began. Tiny, shimmering particles of the purest blue bled from the dough, drifting down through the water to settle at the bottom of the basin like a fallen sky. I repeated the process with fresh water, each time extracting a slightly lighter shade of blue, until only a dull, grayish residue remained in my hands. The first collection was the prize, ultramarine, a color so deep and vibrant it seemed to hum with its own internal light. Staring at the precious sediment, I felt a surge of pride. The dubious deal at the market had yielded something truly divine. With my pigment prepared and drying on a small clay dish, I finally allowed myself to unroll my grandfather's great map. The vellum, a large, supple sheet of the finest calfskin, whispered as it flattened across the wide expanse of my work table. Its surface was a ghost of a world, a faint web of coastlines drawn in pale ink, awaiting the life that color would bring. My grandfather's hand was everywhere, in the confident sweep of a peninsula, the delicate curve of a bay. It was a familiar script I had studied my entire life, yet seeing it here, unfinished, felt like listening to a story that had been cut off mid-sentence. My task was to find the right words, the right lines, to complete it in a voice that honored his. I mixed a small amount of my iron gall ink, a recipe of oak galls and iron salts that turns a deep, permanent black as it dries. Before touching the nib to the vellum, I did as my grandfather had always done. I drew the fine tip of the quill across my tongue. The motion helped to shape the point into a perfect line, but it also left a familiar, faint, bitter taste, the flavor of my craft. It was the taste of concentration, of long hours spent leaning over a table, my entire world shrinking to the space of a few inches of parchment. With a steady hand, I began my work, reinforcing a faint line of coast that snaked around an unknown sea. The sharp, clean black ink flowed smoothly, a stark contrast to the aged vellum.
My focus narrowed until the world outside my workshop ceased to exist. There was only the map, the ink, and the steady beat of my own heart. I traced archipelagos and estuaries, my quill moving with a practiced ease born from thousands of hours of repetition. My eyes, however, were not just seeing lines. They were reading a language. Every cartographer develops their own shorthand, a set of personal symbols for reefs, currents, and safe harbors, and my grandfather's was as familiar to me as my own signature. As I worked my way down a long finger-like peninsula, my gaze snagged on something out of place. It was a tiny annotation, almost lost in the faint grid lines, so small it looked like a stray fleck of dust. Curiosity overpowering my methodical pace, I reached for my magnifying glass, a thick piece of polished crystal set in a brass handle. I held it over the spot, and the tiny marks leaped into focus. They were not a standard navigational symbol or a depth sounding. It was a phrase, written in my grandfather's most compact, private script, a shorthand he used only in his personal journals. My breath caught in my chest as I slowly sounded out the words, my lips moving silently. Where the salt lion weeps. The phrase was nonsense. Lions do not weep, and they certainly are not made of salt. It was utterly out of place on a map meant to chart the known and unknown world. A shiver, entirely unrelated to the cool air drifting in from the canal, ran down my spine. I leaned back, the quill resting forgotten in my inkpot. For the first time, I looked at the map not as a piece of geography, but as a riddle. This wasn't just an unfinished chart, it was something more. My grandfather was a practical man, a master of precision and fact. He did not deal in poetry or riddles, especially not on his most ambitious work. This small, cryptic note was a deliberate secret, a key left behind for someone who knew how to look. The excitement that filled me was sharp and bright, completely eclipsing the guilt from my bargain at the Rialto.
The blue pigment, now a rich, dry powder, sat waiting. My original plan had been to start laying in the vast oceans, to bring the seas to life with that magnificent color. But now that seemed a secondary concern. The true heart of this map was not in its vibrant blues or its perfectly rendered coastlines. It lay hidden in these strange little clues, these whispers from the past. A quirky detail I had once read came to mind. Some ancient mapmakers would deliberately include a single glaring error, a phantom island or a misplaced liver, as a sort of signature to protect their work from being copied. But this felt different. It was not a trap for a plagiarist. It felt like an invitation. I stood there for a long time, the candlelight flickering and making the shadows in the workshop dance. The map on the table before me had transformed. It was no longer simply a surface to be completed, a project to build my reputation upon. It had become a conversation with my grandfather, a puzzle he had left specifically for me to solve. The quest was no longer about finishing his work, but about understanding it. I had uncovered a hidden layer to my inheritance, a secret that would now direct every line I drew and every choice I made. The ultramarine sea on my grandfather's map was a brilliant, unmoving ocean, yet the clue he left behind, where the salt lion weeps, sent me into the heart of Venice's tides of knowledge. My own workshop, full of familiar tools and half-finished charts, held no answers. The phrase was not from any standard pilot book or portolan chart, the detailed maps used by sailors. It was something older, a piece of folklore perhaps, and for that, I needed a different kind of archive. This search required me to leave the comforting clatter of my own street for the profound quiet of the monastery of San Giorgio Maggiore, a place where centuries of written accounts were kept safe from the damp and the decay of the city. As my gondola slid through the quiet canals toward the island, I felt a knot of anticipation tighten in my chest. I was no longer just a map maker, but a detective chasing a whisper through time. The scriptorium, the great library where monks copied and preserved texts, was a world away from the bright, noisy Rialto. Upon entering, the change was immediate. A coolness rose from the stone floor, seeping through the soles of my shoes, and I found myself pulling my woolen cloak a little tighter against a persistent draft that slid through the high arched windows. The dominant scent was not of the sea or of spices, but of aged parchment and the faint, pleasing smell of leather from countless bookbindings. This was a place built to protect paper from the city's constant humidity, and as a result, it felt like a quiet, chilly tomb of knowledge. Tall wooden presses, dark with age, lined the walls, each one filled with scrolls and heavy leather-bound books that held the memories of 1,000 sea voyages. I began my search methodically, moving through the section dedicated to mariners' logs and private journals. These were not the clean, official charts of the Republic, but the personal, often messy, accounts of captains and sailors. My fingers, accustomed to the smooth surface of vellum, now traced the rough, uneven texture of older paper. The pages of one journal felt so delicate, so brittle from time and salt, that I feared they might crumble into dust at my touch. I worked for what felt like hours, my eyes straining in the low light filtering through the tall windows. The only sounds were the soft rustle of turning pages and the distant rhythmic chant of monks from another part of the monastery, a sound that seemed to anchor the silence around me. It was during this deep concentration that I first felt a presence nearby. I looked up from a particularly faded logbook to see an old man observing me from across the long wooden reading table. He was one of Venice's most renowned mapmakers, a master artisan whose work was displayed in the Doge's palace itself. His face was a map of its own, lined with the fine wrinkles of decades spent leaning over charts, and his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He gave me a slow, deliberate nod before rising and walking toward me, his soft leather shoes making almost no sound on the stone floor. His presence felt immense in the quiet room, carrying the weight of a lifetime of expertise. He stopped beside my table, his gaze falling upon the scattered journals and my own small notebook where I had copied my grandfather's cryptic phrase. "Chasing ghosts on parchment, young Bellini?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that did not disturb the room's deep quiet. He gestured toward my work. "There is more profit and less heartache in charting the coast of Dalmatia for the 10th time than in following the whispers of old men." I felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. It was impossible to know the intent behind his words. Was this the kind and fatherly advice of a senior craftsman, or was it a veiled warning from a professional rival telling me to abandon my quest? I simply bowed my head in respect, murmuring that I was merely studying older navigational techniques. His expression remained unreadable, but he patted my shoulder once before turning and leaving me alone in the silence. The master artisan's words, meant perhaps to discourage me, had the opposite effect. His warning suggested that he knew something of these ghosts, that my grandfather's map was not just an unknown project, but one that others were aware of, and perhaps even wary of. This realization fueled a new urgency in my search. I turned back to the stack of journals with renewed focus, my fingers moving more quickly through the brittle pages. I was no longer just looking for a simple landmark. I was now searching for a secret that someone thought was worth protecting, or perhaps worth burying forever. The puzzle had grown larger, and the stakes felt higher than just completing a family legacy. And then I found it. The journal was small, bound in salt-stained leather, its pages warped by moisture. The ink was a faded brown, the handwriting a difficult, spidery script from a sailor over a century ago. As my fingers brushed against the page, the fragile paper felt like a dried leaf. The sailor described a journey to the far eastern edge of the Aegean Sea, detailing a particularly treacherous passage near a rocky coastline. He wrote of a specific rock formation, a tall outcrop that, from the right angle at sea, resembled a lion's head. During the winter storms, he explained, when the tide was at its highest and the wind blew from the north, seawater would be forced up through a hidden channel within the rock, streaming out from the lion's eyes like tears. The wind whistling through the hollows created a sound like a low, mournful howl.
"The salt lion weeps," I whispered to myself, the words barely audible in the vast, quiet room. It was not a myth at all. It was a real place, a specific and dangerous navigational hazard known only to experienced sailors who had survived that passage. My grandfather had not been recording a fantasy. He had been noting a precise physical phenomenon. This single entry transformed the map from a collection of fantastical places into a chart of deeply hidden practical knowledge. The weeping lion was a warning sign, a natural beacon for a deadly reef that would not appear on any official chart of the Republic. It was a secret passed from one sailor to another, and now to me. The depth of my grandfather's work began to settle upon me. He was not merely copying other maps or sketching coastlines from imagination. He was collecting secrets, pieces of dangerous and valuable information that could mean the difference between a successful voyage and a shipwreck. Why would he hide such vital information within a cryptic clue instead of drawing it plainly on the map? What other secrets were hidden behind the elegant lines and brilliant blue of his masterpiece? The master artisan's warning about ghosts on parchment echoed in my mind, and for the first time, I wondered if the danger he spoke of was not failure, but success. I carefully closed the sailor's journal, the worn leather cool and smooth beneath my hand. The scent of old paper and leather seemed to cling to me as I sat there, the weight of this new discovery pressing down. My initial ambition had been simple: to finish the map and make a name for myself, to prove that I was worthy of my grandfather's legacy. But now I saw that the legacy was far more complex than I had ever imagined. It was not just about skill with a quill and brush, but about understanding a hidden language of the sea, a language of secrets and shadows.
My journey to this monastery had started with a simple goal of finding the meaning of a single phrase. I thought I was looking for a location, a key to unlock one small part of the map's geography. Instead, I had found a key to my grandfather's entire method. The map was not just a picture of the world, it was a conversation with it, a record of its hidden dangers and secret passages. I felt a profound connection to him in that moment, an understanding that transcended the years since his passing. He had left me more than a workshop and an unfinished project. He had left me a path to follow, one that led away from the well-charted waters of Venetian commerce and into the unknown. I gathered my notes, my mind racing with the implications of what I had learned. The master artisan's words, the cryptic clue, the sailor's 100-year-old story. They were all threads in a much larger tapestry. As I walked out of the scriptorium, the coolness of the stone giving way to the gentle warmth of the afternoon, I knew my work had changed. I was no longer just completing a map. I was deciphering a testament, a collection of secrets that someone, for some reason, had gone to great lengths to conceal from the world. My life as a cartographer, once a clear path of ink on parchment, had led me to this quiet archive of whispers. I had come seeking a landmark and had instead discovered the true nature of my inheritance, a map not of coasts and currents, but of carefully guarded knowledge. My simple quest for professional recognition had become something far more perilous and profound. The first line had been drawn, not with my pen, but by my grandfather's secrets.
Slow, word travels quickly in Venice, carried on the tides and whispered over market stalls. My work on my grandfather's map, a project I had thought was my own quiet obsession, had become a subject of gossip among the city's artisans and merchants. I should not have been surprised then when a liveried servant appeared at my workshop door one afternoon. He did not knock, but simply stood there, a tall shadow in the bright doorway, holding a rolled parchment tied with a silk ribbon and sealed with a heavy wax crest I recognized at once. It was the mark of one of the most powerful merchant princes in the entire republic, a man whose ships were said to outnumber the Doge's own. The summons was not a request, but a command, and my heart began a slow, heavy beat against my ribs, a drum of warning. The journey by gondola to his palace on the Grand Canal felt like a passage into another world. The familiar sounds of my own neighborhood, the calls of vendors, the laughter of children, the rhythmic splash of a neighbor's laundry being washed in the canal, faded behind me. As we approached his estate, the buildings grew taller and more ornate, their marble facades seeming to lean over the water with an air of silent judgment. My own simple wool tunic felt coarse and inadequate. I gripped the worn leather satchel containing my preliminary sketches, the one thing that gave me a sense of purpose. This prince was known for his vast collection of art and artifacts, but he was also known for his ruthlessness in business. Men who crossed him had a habit of finding their fortunes, and sometimes their lives, cut short. I could not imagine what he wanted with a humble mapmaker. As soon as I stepped from the gondola onto his private landing, a profound quietness enveloped me. The massive, carved wooden doors swung open without a sound,
and closed just as silently behind me, cutting off the last echoes of the canal. The noisy, vibrant city I knew simply ceased to exist. My leather-soled shoes, which usually made a confident clip on stone floors, were completely muffled by thick, patterned carpets from the east. Their intricate designs of vines and beasts seemed to absorb all sound, creating a space where a dropped pin would have sounded like a blacksmith's hammer. A servant, moving with the same ghostly silence, guided me through a long hall, where portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched my progress from behind layers of dark oil and varnish, their eyes seeming to follow me with cold appraisal. Each breath I took felt loud in the stillness. He received me in a room that looked more like a cathedral than a private study. Polished mahogany shelves stretched from the floor to a ceiling painted with figures of gods and heroes. Yet my attention was drawn not to the books or the art, but to the room's only persistent sound, the soft, metallic chime of a water clock in the corner. It was a marvelous device of brass and glass, marking the passage of time with a gentle, hypnotic drop of water every few seconds. Drip, chime, drip, chime. The merchant prince sat behind a desk large enough to serve as a banquet table, his hands steepled before him. He was a man of middle years, dressed in dark velvet that drank the light from the tall windows. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it filled the unnerving silence completely, a low, smooth timbre that seemed to vibrate in the wood of the furniture and the bones in my chest. He gestured for me to unroll my work on a smaller table nearby, and he came to stand beside me, his presence making the back of my neck prickle. He spoke of my grandfather with a surprising degree of knowledge, calling him a true master of the craft. Then he came to the point. He knew of my struggles to acquire the finest materials, the lapis lazuli for the sea, the gold leaf for the borders. With a wave of his hand, he offered to solve all my problems. He would provide unlimited funding, the best vellum from Spain, pigments from the furthest reaches of his trade empire, and access to his private library of sea charts. The map would be a masterpiece, the likes of which Venice had never seen. My mind reeled with the possibilities. I saw the finished map in my mind's eye, gleaming with a blue so deep it looked like the heart of the ocean. Every coastline perfect, every detail a work of art. But as the initial rush of excitement cooled, the memory of my bargain with the spice merchant at the Rialto returned, leaving a sour feeling in my gut. That small act of questionable trade had felt like a compromise. This, however, was something else entirely. In exchange for his patronage, the prince wanted one thing: exclusive ownership of the finished map and all its secrets. It would belong to him, to be locked away in his private collection, or, more likely, used to give his shipping fleet an unrivaled advantage. The dream of completing my grandfather's work for all the world to see, to secure my own name as a cartographer of note, would vanish. I would be nothing more than a well-paid tool, and the map would become a weapon of commerce, a gilded cage for my family's legacy. I found myself torn between two powerful currents. One was the tide of ambition and practicality, pulling me toward a life of ease and professional triumph, where I would never again have to worry about the cost of a pigment or the quality of a quill. The other was a deep, quiet eddy of principle, a loyalty to my grandfather's spirit of discovery and a desire for my work to be my own. Looking at the prince's calm, acquisitive face, I saw a man who collected beautiful things not for their beauty, but for the power they represented. My grandfather's map would be just another jewel in his crown. I knew then what I had to do. I took a steadying breath, the air in the silent room feeling cool in my lungs, and I made my choice. "Your offer is more generous than any artisan could dare to hope for," I began, my voice sounding thin after his resonant tones. "But this map is more than a project. It is a personal matter, a way to honor the memory of the man who taught me everything. For that reason, I cannot part with it. I must complete it myself, with my own hands and my own means." I watched his face for a reaction. For a long moment, there was none. Then his lips curved into a smile that was all courtesy and no warmth, a precise arrangement of his features that did not reach his cold, dark eyes. "A noble sentiment," he said, and the words felt like chips of ice. He turned away, a silent dismissal, and went back to his desk, the interview clearly over.
The servant reappeared as if summoned by an unspoken thought and led me back through the silent halls. As the great doors opened and the sounds of Venice rushed back in, the water, the voices, the life, it was like waking from a dream. But the chill from that room stayed with me. I had walked into that palace a struggling cartographer. I walked out a man who had made a powerful enemy. I had chosen my independence, but in doing so, I had stepped away from the light of patronage and into a shadow of unseen dangers. The freedom I had just preserved felt both intensely precious and terribly fragile. The meeting with the merchant prince had left a residue of cold fear that clung to me like the city's winter fog. In the days that followed, my familiar walks through Venice felt different. The cheerful call of a gondolier, a sound that once brought a smile to my face, now seemed to carry a hidden warning. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, studying the reflections in the dark canal water, not for their beauty, but for any shape that might be following me too closely. My workshop, once a sanctuary of quiet concentration, now felt like a cage where I was both the keeper and the kept, a place too easily watched. This new caution was a heavy cloak, and it made every step I took feel deliberate and weighed down with a significance I had never known before. This newfound wariness altered my path through the city. Instead of taking the open, sunlit squares, I began to favor the quieter, more winding backways. My thinking was that a shadow is harder to spot among countless other shadows. It was a choice born of anxiety, a decision that led me away from the grand canals and into the tight maze of passages that form the city's true circulatory system. These alleys were so narrow in places that a person could touch both walls with outstretched hands. It was on one such evening, as the light began to fail and the stone walls around me seemed to grow taller, that my unease finally took a solid form, blocking the path ahead. He seemed to emerge from the damp stone itself,
A thin man with a face full of sharp angles and eyes that never settled in one place. There was nothing overtly threatening about him, yet my heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I tried to turn back, but he took a quick step to block my retreat. The alley was a trap, and I had walked right into it. The stone walls, which I had sought out for their anonymity, now felt oppressive, their cold surfaces pressing in on me. A constant, irritating drip, drip, drip from an unseen gutter above was the only sound for a long moment. Each drop echoing in the confined space and magnifying the sudden silence between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was a dry, scratchy whisper that seemed to absorb the sound around it, making the dripping water sound even louder by contrast. "Marco Bellini, the map maker," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. The sound of my own name from this stranger's lips sent a fresh chill down my spine. I said nothing, merely clutching the satchel at my side, my knuckles white. He saw the movement, and a thin smile stretched his lips. "You are looking for secrets," he whispered, leaning closer. "You follow a ghost on an old map. But ghosts leave behind pieces of themselves, do they not?" His words hung in the air, each one a carefully placed weight. From inside his worn tunic, he produced a small rolled piece of parchment, holding it between two fingers as if it were a jewel. "The master artisan," the man said, his voice dropping even lower. "He is old. He grows careless. This was on his private work table." My eyes fixed on the small scroll, my mind raced with possibilities. It could be a trap, a plant from the merchant prince, meant to lead me into ruin. It could be a trick by the master himself, a test of my character. Or, just perhaps, it was exactly what this man claimed, a genuine piece of a puzzle I was desperate to solve. The price he named was steep, nearly all the coin I had left from my trade at the Rialto. I hesitated, my thoughts a tangled knot of suspicion and yearning. To complete my grandfather's work was the driving force of my life, the reason I rose each morning. That desire warred with the primal instinct to flee, to throw the coins at him and run from this damp, cold alley and the danger it represented. The man watched my internal struggle, his gaze unwavering. He knew the nature of obsession. It was a currency he clearly traded in as often as silver. The thought that this small rolled-up secret could shorten my search, that it might hold a key, was a powerful lure. My hand trembled slightly as I reached into my purse. The decision felt less like a choice and more like a surrender to my own ambition. Part of me screamed that I was being a fool, yet the part of me that was my grandfather's student, the part that lived for the thrill of a coastline taking shape under my quill, compelled me forward. I counted out the coins, their metallic clink unnaturally loud in the quiet passage. He snatched them from my palm with a bird-like quickness, his dry fingers brushing against mine. In return, he pressed the parchment into my hand. It felt brittle and ancient. He was gone as quickly as he had appeared, melting back into the deepening shadows from which he came, leaving me alone with the incessant dripping and the pounding of my own heart. The stone walls felt slick and cold as I steadied myself against them, my breathing coming in short, sharp bursts. The alley suddenly felt colder, emptier. I clutched the fragment in my fist, the rough texture of the parchment, a solid, real thing in a world that had become dangerously uncertain. For a moment, I just stood there, listening, ensuring I was truly alone before I dared to move. Making my way out of the alley and back into the more open, torch-lit streets, I did not feel relief. Instead, a profound sense of exposure washed over me. I had crossed a line. My work was no longer confined to the quiet solitude of my shop, a place of ink and scholarship. I had actively purchased a stolen secret in a dark passage, engaging with the city's underbelly in a way I never had before. The knowledge of what I had done and what I now carried made me feel as if every passerby could see the truth of it marked on my face. Back in my workshop, with the heavy wooden door bolted behind me, the familiar space offered little comfort. The scent of drying ink and old paper, usually so reassuring, did nothing to calm the tremor in my hands. I placed the purchased fragment on my workbench, its edges curled with age. It lay there under the candlelight, a tiny object representing a huge risk. I had invited the spies and the whispers into my life, and now I had to live with them. The quiet pursuit of my craft had led me into a very loud and dangerous world. I looked from the fragment to my grandfather's grand, unfinished map. Before, my challenges had been matters of skill, of finding the right pigment or interpreting a faded line. They were the honorable struggles of a craftsman. Now, the challenges were of a different sort entirely. They involved deception, theft, and shadowy figures in wet alleys. This single desperate transaction had altered the very nature of my quest. The path to finishing my grandfather's work was no longer just a journey across parchment. It was now a perilous navigation through the hidden currents of my own city. This dark bargain had changed how I viewed the quiet, noble work of my hands. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the narrow passage leading back to my workshop, the small roll of parchment a tight, tense coil in my hand. A mix of excitement and deep unease churned within me. The informant's whisper still felt like a spider's thread against my ear, promising a key while his eyes promised only trouble. Back in the alley, the cold, slick stone had seemed to press in on me, but now, turning the iron key in my own door, the familiar scent of wood, ink, and drying vellum was a comfort. It was the smell of my entire life, of my grandfather's legacy. Yet, as I stepped inside and barred the door, the small workshop no longer felt like a perfect sanctuary. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, and the silence was filled with the questions I had brought home with me.
With deliberate slowness, I placed the purchased fragment on the great oak workbench that dominated the room. My hands, usually so steady when holding a quill, felt clumsy. This single piece of parchment could be the breakthrough I needed, the missing link in my grandfather's great work. Or it could be a clever lie, a trap set by unseen hands. To find out, I needed light, the truest and most honest tool in any mapmaker's workshop. I lit a thick tallow candle, the flame sputtering to life and casting a warm, dancing glow across the wood. Then, from its velvet-lined case, I retrieved my most prized possession after my grandfather's compass, a heavy magnifying glass, its lens ground in Murano by the finest craftsmen. Under its unforgiving eye, the truth of the parchment would be revealed, for better or worse. I unrolled the fragment carefully, using smooth river stones as weights to hold the curling edges flat. At first glance, my heart gave a hopeful leap. The style was uncannily familiar. The sweep of the coastline, the delicate stippling used to mark a shallow bay, the precise, elegant script. It all looked like my grandfather's work. It felt like finding a lost letter from a loved one, a sudden and powerful connection to him across the years. For a fleeting moment, I let myself believe. I imagined this piece fitting perfectly into the larger map, the mysteries of the East unlocking before my very eyes. This, I thought, was worth the price the informant demanded, and more. My fingers traced a familiar curve of a peninsula, the phantom sensation of my grandfather's own hand guiding mine.
My training, however, soon overpowered my hope. A cartographer must be a skeptic first and an artist second. I began my examination not with the lines on the map, but with the material itself. I brought the magnifying glass close to the edge of the vellum, the prepared animal skin that served as the foundation for all great maps. My grandfather had always sourced his vellum from a specific monastery known for its quality. Their skins were superb, but never perfect. You could always find the faint, ghostly pattern of the animal's veins if you looked closely enough. Under the lens, the fibers of this fragment were different. They were too even, too uniform, lacking the subtle, natural imperfections of a true skin. It was a masterful piece of work, certainly, but it felt manufactured, lacking the faint spark of life inherent in the real thing. A small, cold knot of doubt began to form in my stomach. From the parchment, I moved to the ink. This was a subject I knew intimately. My grandfather had taught me to mix my own iron gall ink, a difficult process involving oak galls, small round growths from oak trees, iron salts, and a binder like gum arabic. Every cartographer's recipe was slightly different, a closely guarded secret. My grandfather's ink, when it dried, possessed a unique, subtle sheen, a deep black that almost seemed to have a hint of purple in the candlelight. I leaned closer, angling the fragment so the flame reflected off its surface. The ink on this map was black, true, but it was a flat, dull black. It absorbed the light without a flicker of life. It was good ink, the kind any public scribe might use, but it was not the living, breathing ink of my family's workshop. The knot of doubt tightened.
The forger's skill was undeniable, and his study of my grandfather's work was impressive. He had copied the lettering with painstaking precision. Yet a man's hand, his unique way of moving a pen, is a difficult thing to truly imitate. For hours I scanned the fragment, comparing the letters and symbols to those on my grandfather's confirmed works. Finally, I found it. In the corner of the fragment was a small decorative compass rose, a flower-like design showing the directions. The northern flourish, a graceful spear point on my grandfather's maps, had a tiny, almost invisible hesitation at the apex of its curve. It was a minuscule wobble, the mark of a hand that was copying a shape rather than drawing it from instinct. My grandfather's hand had been as sure as the tide. He would never have faltered. It was the final, damning piece of evidence. With a heavy heart, I slid the forgery next to the faint outlines of my grandfather's true map. The coastlines appeared to match, a testament to the forger's craft. But a map is more than a picture. It is a precise mathematical document. I took up my brass dividers, the two sharp points used to measure distances. Setting them to a known league on my grandfather's map, I transferred the measurement to the new fragment. The distance was wrong. It was subtly stretched, elongated by no more than a hair's breadth, but the difference was there. Following the altered coastline with my finger, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The altered geography guided any ship following it not to a safe harbor, but directly toward a notorious stretch of sea marked on legitimate charts as the Dragon's Teeth, a wicked reef known for tearing the hulls out of unsuspecting vessels. This was not merely a fake. It was a weapon. A map designed to kill, to send a ship and its crew to the bottom of the sea. The realization washed over me, cold and sickening. Someone had gone to enormous trouble, not just to deceive me, but to create a tool of destruction and place it in my hands. My mind raced, trying to untangle the web of possibilities. Was this the work of the master artisan from the scriptorium, a man who warned me about chasing ghosts? Perhaps this was his brutal way of frightening me off the path. Or did it come from the merchant prince whose offer of patronage I had refused? Maybe this was his revenge, a way to ensure my project, and perhaps I myself, ended in ruin. The faces of the few people who knew of my work swam before my eyes, each one now a mask hiding unknown intentions. My first impulse was one of pure, unthinking anger. I reached for the fraudulent map, my fingers curling, ready to crush it into a ball and throw it into the small brazier I used for heat. To burn it would be a cleansing act. A mapmaker's work is a sacred trust. We chart the world, making it known and safe for others. This thing on my table was a perversion of that trust, a lie given geographical form. Destroying it felt like a moral duty, a way to purge its poison from my workshop. My grandfather's memory demanded it. The thought of this map ever being mistaken for his work made my throat tighten with a protective fury. It was an insult to everything he had taught me about the pursuit of truth. But as my hand hovered over the parchment, a different thought, colder and more calculating, pushed its way through the heat of my anger. This city, Venice, had taught me that information was a currency and sometimes a weapon. A lie could be just as powerful as the truth if wielded correctly. If someone was hunting for my grandfather's secrets, if they believed I was on the verge of uncovering them, then perhaps this forgery had another purpose. It was a tool meant for me, but maybe I could turn it into a tool I could use against them. The idea felt dangerous, a step into the world of shadows inhabited by informants and ruthless merchants. It was a world my grandfather had avoided, but one I was quickly learning I could not escape. After a long moment, I made my choice. I did not burn the map. Instead, I carefully rolled it back into a tight scroll, the false coastlines disappearing into a cylinder of deceit. I found an old, unmarked storage tube in the corner of the workshop, one meant for discarded sketches, and slid the forgery inside. It was a risk. Keeping such a dangerous object felt like inviting a viper into my home. Yet throwing it away felt like discarding a shield I did not yet know how to use. By keeping it, I was accepting that my quest was no longer a simple matter of completing a map. It had become a silent battle of wits, and this forgery was now the first piece of ammunition I possessed. The workshop felt different after that. The comforting familiarity was gone, replaced by a new tension. Every shadow seemed to hold a spy, and every gust of wind against the shutters sounded like a footstep. I looked at my grandfather's true map, its faint lines holding a genuine hidden truth, and then at the sealed tube containing its malicious twin. I was now the keeper of both a great secret and a great lie. The boy who had simply wanted to finish his grandfather's work to make a name for himself was gone, replaced by a man walking a far more treacherous path. I carried the weight of this false map with me, a hidden deception that reshaped my understanding of the journey ahead. The forged map fragment sat on my workbench, a cold and useless thing. Its carefully crafted lies were a clear warning that the secret I chased was not one to be found in the open markets or even the dusty libraries of Venice. Someone was actively trying to mislead me, to send me chasing phantoms while they pursued the real prize. This deception solidified a thought that had been growing in my mind for days. The answer was not on the map itself, but hidden somewhere in my grandfather's world, a world contained within the four walls of this workshop. Consequently, I pushed the grand map aside, its beautiful but empty oceans a monument to my own ignorance, and turned my attention to the shelves that lined the room. My grandfather's library was his true legacy. It was not a grand collection of expensive leather-bound histories, but a working man's library filled with practical knowledge. There were thin volumes on the mixing of inks, their pages stained with the very colors they described. Heavy atlases from Genoa and Portugal sat beside books of celestial charts, their corners worn soft from years of use. He had books on shipbuilding, on the winds of the southern seas, and on the strange herbs used by physicians in faraway lands. I ran my hand along their spines, feeling the different textures of worn leather and stiff vellum. Each one was a piece of him, but I did not know which piece held the key I so desperately needed. For days I searched. I shook every book, hoping for a loose page to fall out. I held each one up to the light of the window, looking for markings or notes tucked into the bindings. The work was slow and disheartening. My back ached from leaning over the dusty shelves, and my fingers were smudged with the grime of ages. At night, the lapping of the canal water against the stone foundation seemed to mock my slow progress, a constant reminder of the sea that remained just beyond my understanding. I began to fear that I was wrong, that the only secret my grandfather had left was the one in his own mind, now lost to the grave forever. This growing despair made each new book I picked up feel heavier than the last. My search eventually led me to a small, unassuming volume tucked away on a lower shelf, almost hidden behind a stack of tide charts. It was not a book of maps or stars, but a simple catalogue of pigment recipes, titled De Arte Illuminandi, on the art of illumination. It was a book I knew well, one of the first my grandfather had ever shown me. I remembered him teaching me how to grind malachite for a vibrant green, or how to boil oak galls with iron salts to create the perfect black ink. It felt like a dead end, a book of simple craft, not hidden knowledge. Yet something about its familiarity called to me, a whisper from the past. It was the binding that felt wrong. As I held the book, running my thumb along the spine, I noticed a slight thickness, an unevenness I had never detected before. It was almost imperceptible, a slight bulge in the warm leather near the top. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest. With the delicate tip of my burnishing tool, I carefully worked at the seam where the leather folded over the stiff board of the cover. The old glue was brittle and gave way with a faint crackling sound. As I pried the leather back, I caught a scent, not of dust or decay, but the faint, ghostly perfume of dried lavender, a trick my grandfather used to keep insects from eating the pages. Tucked inside, nestled against the wooden board of the cover, was a single folded piece of vellum. It was so thin it was nearly transparent, and it crackled like a dry leaf as I carefully unfolded it. My hands trembled, making the candlelight dance across the surface. It was not a map, not in any way I recognized. It was covered in my grandfather's familiar spidery handwriting, but the page was filled with strange diagrams, celestial charts, overlaid with numbers, and lines connecting constellations to specific points on a simplified, almost abstract coastline. It was a cipher, a key designed to unlock a language I never knew existed. I rushed back to the great map on my workbench, the hidden vellum held carefully in one hand. I spread the key beside it, and the world shifted. The faint coastal outlines on my grandfather's map were not just geography. They were shapes meant to echo the star patterns in the sky. A peninsula I had assumed was part of India was shaped precisely like the constellation Orion. A chain of islands followed the curve of Draco, the dragon. The cryptic notes I had struggled with, like "where the salt lion weeps," were not just pointing to places. The key revealed them to be something more. They were dates, tied to the rising and setting of certain stars. The realization washed over me, a wave of cold shock and profound awe.
My grandfather's map was not a guide to a place, but a guide to a time. It was a celestial calendar of the sea. It predicted the precise, short-lived moments in a year when the heavens aligned with the earth. During these times, treacherous tides would calm, dangerous currents would reverse, and hidden channels would become deep enough for a ship to pass. He had charted a way through impassable waters, not by mapping the rocks, but by mapping the sky and the ocean's deep rhythms. This was its secret, a secret so valuable it could build an empire or destroy one. This new understanding changed everything. My grandfather, the man I remembered as a quiet craftsman who smelled of ink and parchment, was transformed in my mind. He was not merely an explorer charting new lands. He was a keeper of a profound and dangerous truth, a man who understood the fundamental secrets of the sea in a way no one else did. He had not been creating a simple map for profit or fame. He had been encoding knowledge of immense power. The question that burned in my mind now was no longer how to finish the map, but why? Why would he go to such lengths to hide this knowledge in such a complex way? The answer felt as dangerous as the secret itself. This was not the kind of information one shares with the world. In the hands of a man like the merchant prince, it would be a weapon. He could create a monopoly on a trade route, bankrupting his rivals by sailing where they could not. He could send warships through passages others believed were myths, striking his enemies without warning. This knowledge was power, the kind of power that drove the greed of Venice, the kind that started wars and built fortunes on the ruin of others. My grandfather had not been hiding a treasure. He had been protecting the world from it.
I looked down at the key, its vellum so fragile in my calloused hands. The ink, once just familiar marks, now seemed alive with significance. I could feel the slight texture of it, raised from the page where my grandfather's quill had pressed down decades ago. He had left this for me, not as an inheritance to be sold, but as a burden to be carried. The boy who had dreamed of making a name for himself, of seeing his work praised in the halls of the Doge's palace, felt like a distant memory. He had wanted to reveal his grandfather's genius to the world, but now I understood that was the one thing I must never do. A profound sense of solitude settled over me in the quiet of the workshop. The weight of this legacy felt heavier than any atlas on my shelves. The merchant prince, the master artisan, the spice merchant, they were all chasing a map of coastlines and ports. They had no idea what they were truly after. They saw a path to riches, but my grandfather had charted a path of wisdom, one that required patience and understanding, not force. He had trusted that I would see the difference, that I would look past the surface and find the true heart of his work. My task had changed completely. Before, my greatest challenge was finding the right shade of blue to paint the sea. Now, I had to decide the fate of the seas themselves. The lines on the parchment were no longer just ink. They were a silent promise, a duty passed from one generation to the next.
The work ahead was no longer about discovery, but about guardianship. My journey to complete a map had become a quest to protect the profound secret it contained. The vellum key, tucked securely inside my tunic, felt heavier than any stone. Its discovery had redrawn the entire world in my mind, transforming my grandfather's map from a simple chart of coastlines into a complex celestial clock. With this new understanding, the actions of others began to shift into focus, especially the strange behavior of the master artisan. I knew then that my next journey was not to some dusty archive, but to his workshop across the city. I had to face him, not with accusations that would lead only to denials, but with the truth I now held. It was a key, and I intended to see which lock it would turn. This knowledge was a heavy cloak, and I needed to know if I wore it alone. This thought led me to leave my own workshop just as the first gray light of dawn touched the canals, turning the dark water to polished slate. A cool breeze from the lagoon made me pull my own cloak tighter around my shoulders, the damp wool a familiar comfort against the morning chill. Venice was stirring to life around me. The rhythmic splash of an early gondolier's oar echoed between the stone buildings, and from an open window somewhere above, I could hear the gentle clatter of a baker setting out his wares. The city was exactly as it had always been, yet everything felt different. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every quiet alley a silent question. My own footsteps on the worn stone bridges felt more deliberate, carrying the weight of a legacy far greater than I had ever imagined. Upon reaching the master artisan's workshop, I found the door already open to the small square. Unlike my own creative clutter, his space was a model of stern order. Tools were not merely stored, but displayed, each burnisher and quill in its precise place. He stood at a tall desk, his back to me, examining a chart under the clean morning light. His hands, though wrinkled with age, moved with a steadiness that I had always envied, a testament to a lifetime of discipline. He did not turn as I entered, but simply said, "The tides wait for no man, young Bellini, nor does the ink dry any slower for your hesitation. State your purpose." The greeting was as sharp and precise as the lines he drew.
I did not present the forged map, nor did I mention the informant from the alley. Such things were now merely symptoms of a deeper truth. Instead, I stepped closer and spoke of a puzzle, a theoretical problem for a navigator. "Master," I began, my voice steady, "imagine a captain who wishes to sail through the Serpent's Teeth Pass off the Dalmatian coast. But he must do so in the dead of winter, when the constellation of the Dragon is at its highest point. The currents are treacherous, the tides impossible. How could he possibly find safe passage?" I had chosen my words with care. The puzzle was a fantasy. No sane mariner would attempt such a thing unless he knew the secret of the celestial calendar. For a long moment, the master artisan remained perfectly still. The only sound in the workshop was the distant cry of gulls. I watched the line of his shoulders, expecting a dismissal, perhaps even a sharp rebuke for wasting his time with such foolish riddles.
Instead, a deep sigh escaped him, a sound of profound weariness, as if a great weight had finally been set down. He turned slowly, his face not angry or annoyed, but etched with a look of resigned sadness. He studied my face, his gaze searching and intense, and the walls of his professional fortress seemed to crumble. "Your grandfather," he said, his voice now quiet and rough, "was the most stubborn man I ever knew. I see now that he passed that trait on to you, along with his secrets." He gestured for me to follow him into a small private study at the back of the workshop, a room filled with leather-bound books and rolled charts that smelled of old paper and beeswax. It was here that the confession finally came, not in a torrent, but as a slow, steady stream. He and my grandfather, he explained, were members of a small, undeclared society of cartographers. They were not rivals in the way the world understood it, but guardians. They had sworn an oath to protect certain kinds of knowledge, discoveries too dangerous for the open market, where they could be turned into weapons of commerce and war. They shared their findings only with each other, hiding them in plain sight within their maps. This revelation reshaped my entire understanding of the world I inhabited. The purpose of this secrecy, he explained, was to keep the knowledge from men like the merchant prince. "Think, Marco," he said, his eyes burning with conviction. "If that man knew the exact time and route to bypass the Ottoman patrols, he would not use it to bring prosperity to Venice. He would use it to create a monopoly on the spice trade, so complete that he could bankrupt every other house in this city. He would own the council, and his greed would fuel a war that would bleed this republic dry." The master's words painted a chilling picture, transforming the prince from a mere patron into a potential tyrant. His warnings in the scriptorium, he admitted, had been the first test, a simple attempt to see if I could be discouraged. When I persisted, he grew more concerned. The forged map, he confessed with a heavy heart, had been his own creation, a final, desperate effort to frighten me away from a path he believed would lead to my ruin. It was a masterfully crafted lie, he said, a flicker of professional pride in his eyes before it was regret. "I hoped you would see the flaws, believe it to be a trap from the prince, and abandon your grandfather's work for your own safety. I had to know if you sought knowledge for its own sake, or merely for the gold it might bring." With the truth finally laid bare between us, the old master retrieved a small, unlabeled bottle and 2 tiny glasses from a locked cabinet. He poured a measure of clear liquid into each. It was grappa, the fiery spirit distilled from the leftovers of the winemaking process. He pushed one glass toward me. "For the truth," he said, simply. I hesitated for a second, then took the glass. The fiery liquid burned a trail down my throat, a clean, shocking heat that seemed to scour away the last of my doubts and fears. In its searing wake, my mind felt incredibly clear, the pieces of the puzzle settling into a complete, undeniable picture. Looking at the old man across the table, I no longer saw a competitor or a threat. I saw an ally, a fellow guardian in a quiet, unseen struggle. The bitterness I had felt over his deceptions dissolved, replaced by a profound respect. My grandfather had not left me a simple inheritance of tools and parchment. He had left me a place in this hidden world, a responsibility to be earned. The master artisan had not been trying to sabotage my work, but to test my character. He was protecting not just his own secrets, but my grandfather's as well, and perhaps even me. As I finally took my leave and stepped back out into the Venetian morning, the city's sounds seemed unchanged, but my place within it felt entirely new. The weight in my tunic was no longer just a key to a map. It was a key to a sacred duty. My quest was not about finishing a masterpiece for my own glory. It was about becoming worthy of the trust my grandfather had placed in me, a trust that reached beyond the grave. The full consequences of the knowledge I now shared would reveal themselves in their own time, but for the first time, I felt I would not have to face them alone. The grappa's fire had long since faded from my throat, but a different kind of warmth lingered in my workshop, the steady presence of the master artisan at my side. We stood before the great vellum sheet, its coastlines and currents now a language I finally understood. The soft lapping of canal water against the stone foundation was the only sound, a gentle rhythm counting the moments before a choice I had to make. My grandfather's tools lay on the workbench, their wooden handles worn smooth by a lifetime of use. Picking up his heaviest burnishing tool, a polished agate stone set in a walnut grip, I felt its familiar weight, a solid anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The map was no longer just a project to win me fame. It was a legacy, a burden, and a key to a world of dangerous secrets.
This new reality presented three distinct and unsettling paths forward. The master artisan remained silent, his expression unreadable, knowing the final step of this journey was mine to take alone. My mind first drifted to the most obvious path, the one the boy I used to be would have seized without a second thought. I could take the completed map, with its celestial key, directly to the Doge's palace. I imagined the scene in the Grand Council chamber, the astonished faces of the city's leaders, the whispered praise, the clinking of gold ducats promised as a reward. Fame would be immediate, my family name secured for generations. My workshop would become the most sought after in all of Venice, perhaps all of Italy. My future would be paved with wealth and recognition, a cartographer celebrated as a genius. However, that vision quickly soured. I pictured the merchant prince's cold, triumphant smile, knowing he would be first in line to exploit this knowledge. The secret routes would not bring prosperity to all. They would become weapons in the relentless wars of commerce. His ships would dominate the spice trade, bankrupting his rivals, and consolidating power into his hands. The knowledge my grandfather had so carefully protected would be used to create monopolies, to starve out smaller traders, and to fuel the very greed he and the master had sought to contain. The sea, a source of connection and discovery,
would be turned into just another battlefield. The thought left a bitter taste in my mouth, like the iron gall ink on my quill. The gold would feel as heavy and cold as a tombstone. From that bitter thought, my mind swung to the opposite extreme. If revealing the map would cause such strife, then perhaps its secrets should be returned to the void. A single oil lamp, knocked over with purpose, could accomplish the task in minutes. I imagined the vellum curling at the edges, the brilliant ultramarine blue blackening, the delicate ink lines vanishing into smoke and ash. All the years of my grandfather's labor, all my own frantic efforts, all the secrets of the tides and stars would be gone forever. There would be a strange peace in that destruction, a certainty that no one could ever use this knowledge for ill. But it also felt like a profound betrayal, an act of cowardice that would erase not only the map, but the memory of the man who created it. It would be a quiet ending, but an empty one.
This feeling of emptiness led me to consider the third path, the one that lay between the fire of ambition and the ash of surrender. I looked at the master artisan, his face etched with the lines of a long life spent balancing knowledge and wisdom. He had tested me, not out of malice, but to see if I understood that some information is too powerful to be simply owned or discarded. It must be cared for, like a rare plant that could either yield a great medicine or a deadly poison, depending on the hand that tends it. My grandfather hadn't created a treasure to be spent. He had forged a responsibility to be carried. He was not just a map maker, he was a guardian. The thought settled not with a crash, but with a quiet click, like a lock finding its key. It is a curious thing, is it not? How a person can spend their life chasing a destination, only to find the journey itself was the true purpose. All my efforts had been focused on completing this map to prove my worth to the world. I had wanted my name to be spoken with the same reverence as my grandfather's. Yet standing here, I realized his true legacy was not his public fame, but his private integrity. He had chosen a harder path, one of silent duty over celebrated success. To follow in his footsteps meant embracing that same quiet purpose, understanding that the greatest act of a cartographer might not be to reveal the world, but to protect its most dangerous corners from the charts of greedy men. My gaze fell upon the vast, empty ocean at the center of the vellum. It was a space yet to be filled with that brilliant, expensive blue, the color of a twilight sky over the Adriatic. As I looked at the blank space, a strange sensation washed over me. It was no longer just an empty patch of parchment waiting for pigment. I could almost feel the stinging salt spray on my face from a voyage I would never take. In the quiet of my workshop, I thought I could hear the distant cry of gulls over a rocky shore I would never visit. A warmth spread through my chest, not the heat of a Venetian afternoon, but the imagined warmth of a far-off sun on a ship's deck, a sun I would never feel on my own skin.
This map was not a window to the world for others, but a world contained for me to understand and to keep. The boy who had made a questionable deal at the Rialto for a few stones of lapis lazuli felt like a stranger to me now. He had been so concerned with materials, with the physical components of his craft. He had not yet understood that the ink and parchment were merely the vessel. The true substance of the work was the wisdom to know when to draw a line and when to leave the page blank for the safety of others. My ambition had been a ship with a grand sail, but my grandfather's legacy was the rudder, guiding me toward a safer harbor. Reaching for my finest brush, the one with bristles so soft they could render the most delicate wave, I felt a new sense of calm. The weight in my chest was not gone, but it had transformed from the heavy stone of uncertainty into the solid weight of purpose. The merchant prince would eventually turn his attention elsewhere, his spies finding no new charts leaving my workshop. The master artisan would grow older, and one day this responsibility would be mine alone. The thought did not frighten me as it once would have. Instead, it felt right, a mantle settling comfortably upon my shoulders. I dipped the brush into a small ceramic bowl where I had begun to mix the ultramarine pigment. The deep, vibrant blue swirled, as rich and mysterious as the oceans it was meant to represent. The path ahead was clear. I would complete the map, filling in every detail with the precision and artistry my grandfather had taught me. I would learn its secrets, understand its celestial clockwork, and hold it as he had. It would not hang in the Doge's palace or be sold for a mountain of gold. It would remain here, in this quiet workshop by the canal, a testament not to discovery, but to restraint.
The master artisan placed a hand gently on my shoulder, a simple gesture of understanding that spoke more than any words could. He had found the successor he had been searching for, the next link in their quiet chain of guardians. He gave a single, slow nod, his eyes reflecting the deep blue of the pigment in my bowl. His approval was the only worldly recognition I now needed. My work would be seen by no one else, but it would be done with more care and devotion than any piece I had ever created for a paying client. It was a private commission from the past, for the sake of the future. My hand was perfectly steady as I lifted the brush, heavy with its precious color, and moved it toward the map. The first stroke would not be for fame nor for wealth. It would be an oath, made in silence and pigment, to honor a legacy of wisdom. It was the beginning of my true work, a life spent not in charting new lands for others to conquer, but in protecting the knowledge that could save them from their own ambitions. The world outside would continue its noisy, hurried pursuit of riches and power. But here, in the quiet of this room, a different kind of treasure would be kept safe. My understanding of what it meant to be a mapmaker, a true student of the world, had shifted in a way I could never have anticipated. I was not charting a route to the east, but to a different kind of future, one built not on what was found, but on what was purposefully, carefully, and dutifully kept hidden. The brush touched the vellum, and the silent work of a guardian began. In the final chapter, Marco, guided by the master artisan,
confronts the three possible fates for his grandfather's secret map: revealing it for fame, destroying it for peace, or becoming its silent guardian, and ultimately chooses the path of duty, accepting his role in a secret tradition of protecting dangerous knowledge. Marco has made his final transformative choice, and with the master artisan's approval, he begins the painstaking work of completing the celestial map, not for public acclaim, but as his new dedicated guardian. And so, our time in the cartographer's workshop comes to a gentle close for the night. The final stroke of ink has dried on the vellum, and the vibrant lapis seas and gilded coastlines are carefully rolled away. The dividers and quills are laid to rest in their wooden box, their work complete until the morning light. Outside, the soft lapping of the canal waters against ancient stone is the city's hushed lullaby. Just as our Venetian map seller sets the known world aside for the evening, you too can now set aside the charts and complexities of your own day. Let your thoughts soften and your mind become a quiet harbor, sheltered from any lingering concerns. May you find peaceful passage into your dreams, sailing toward the calm, undiscovered shores of deep and restorative rest. Sleep well.